Hello, everyone. A pleasant afternoon to those of you who are joining us from Manila, Perth, and other places in the region, and a good day to those of you who are coming in from everywhere else in the world. On behalf of the Ateneo de Manila University Press and the Department of History, we'd like to thank you for being with us for this event, the double launch of the 40th anniversary edition of the Sulu Zone and the James F. Warren Collection. We'll begin the program with remarks from the Vice President for the Loyola Schools, the Dean of the School of Social Sciences, the Director of the University Press, as well as a few surprise messages for Professor Warren.
I can hear it, hon. I can hear this. I can hear it. What? What? Something's happened there.
Thank you, everyone. Just give us a moment. I think we're having a bit of technical difficulties, but we're aware that there's no audio coming in.
Greetings to Professor James Francis Warren, Dr. Sarina Akpeduno, Father Joey Cruz, Ms. Karina Bolasco, Dr. David Lozada, faculty members, students, historians, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone to this gathering that's being sponsored by the Ateneo de Manila University Press, together with the Department of History. We are relaunching a book that has made waves as a classic in Southeast Asian studies since its first publication in 1981. The 40th anniversary edition of Sulu Zone is a milestone for scholars. It couldn't have come at a better time than this, where there is a more articulated impetus in scholarship related to Southeast Asia. More than a launch, this event is a celebration of gratitude for Professor James Francis Warren, Emeritus Professor of Southeast Asian Modern History at Murdoch University. Professor Warren, from the generosity of his heart, has bequeathed his precious collection of books from his personal, professional library to us at Ateneo de Manila University. He could have chosen another university, but no, he chose Ateneo de Manila. Professor Warren's donation will certainly enhance the prestige of Ateneo de Manila, particularly its Rizal Library, as a repository of a special collection of resources of works about the regions of the Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean world. It is our great honor to house your treasures, Professor Warren, and we promise to take care of these and make your legacy flourish through the wealth that it brings to historians and knowledge production. We are humbled by your kindness and inspired by your example. So a toast to 40 years of Sulu Zone, a toast to scholarship inspired by Professor Warren's magnanimity. I wish you all an enjoyable evening.
Hi, Jim. Congratulations to you and to all those involved with this production and the reprint.
I'm terrified of the technology, but for you, I'm going to just give it a shot, see if I can make it work. We go back 50 years, and as you will remember. But the highlight that I think I'd want to just stress on this occasion is the whole issue of how to approach slavery. I realized when daring to go back beyond my comfort zone into the early modern period that slavery was a huge issue, which people who wrote on Southeast Asia didn't want to touch. I mean, particularly in the nationalist paradigm, you had to be a victim, and slavery could be what other folks did to us, but you couldn't. We didn't do it. No, we couldn't do it because that was not helpful for the paradigm. So I was very pleased when Jim Hovden decided this isn't what he initially wanted to do. And I wasn't sure that I did, but I nudged a little bit, and we compromised on what he eventually did, which was certainly dealing on a large scale and in great depth with the issue. And I'm immensely grateful for that. Thank you, Jim.
I came into contact with Jim's work in about the late 1990s, and as it turned out, my own interests in historical processes in Eastern Indonesia in the pre-colonial and early colonial times interestingly paralleled some of the perspectives found in Jim's work, especially the Sulu zone. On a much less spectacular level than Sulu, a system of slaving circuits could be detected both around Timor and in the region of Sumbawa, connected both to indigenous economy and colonial zones in the early modern era. So Jim has been quite important as an inspirer to look beyond the conventional Western narratives of the history of maritime Southeast Asia.
Oh my gosh.
Hi, Jim. Many congratulations on the publication of this 40th anniversary edition of the Sulu Zone with Ateneo Press. I was trying to work out how long it is that we've known each other, and while it's not quite our 40th anniversary, it must be getting pretty close to it, so it's a long time. And the Sulu Zone, of course, has been a landmark publication, not only in Philippine studies, but in Southeast Asian studies too. And I remember being introduced to it by you, of course, when I went to your old office at Murdoch as a new PhD student, and you gave me a huge pile of books that you said I really just had to read. And it included Al McCoy, Dan Dapper's, John Larkin, Norman Owen, and of course, James Warren. And while the subject of the Sulu book has never really been particularly germane to my own research, it was one of the first books that I read that really made me start to think about how the environment affects human societies. And so I would regard it as landmark in setting me off along that environmental path. It also introduced me to the concept of prosopography as a methodology, and I, of course, went on to use that in my own study of crime in the 19th century. So, as guide, mentor, colleague, and of course, above all, as friend, a big thank you, and once again, many, many congratulations.
Good afternoon. Today we are not only marking the 40th anniversary of Professor Emeritus James Francis Warren's classic, we are also launching the JFW Collection and the JFW Research Fellowships. The JFW Collection is the professional library of James F. Warren, donated to the Ateneo de Manila University through the special collections of the Rizal Library. When I came in as Dean of the School of Social Sciences in August of this year, one of the first emails I received was from Dr. Pat Nakudao of the Department of History, letting me know that the first batch of Professor Warren's donation, consisting of 25 boxes, was already with the shippers in Perth. From the email threads that Pat shared with me so I would learn about the background of the donation, I found out about initial talks of establishing a research fellowship. The idea excited me and I convened the JFW working group. I am grateful to Father Joey Cruz, Dr. Jose Joel Canuday, Professor Ambeth Ocampo, Dr. Chas Navarro, and Dr. Pat Nakudao for accepting the important task of providing advice on the donation and scholarly use, which includes the creation of the JFW Research Fellowship. I would also like to thank Dr. Von Totanes, Ms. Dea Santos, Ms. Matet Villanueva, and Ms. Teng Montejo of the Rizal Library for this partnership. The JFW collection points to a global Southeast Asia and the intersections of history and science on environment and climate change. It is a collection that will support the teaching, research, and outreach agenda of the School of Social Sciences, anchored on multicultural, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary understanding of the Southeast Asian region and the wider world. It is an agenda that recognizes that a full understanding of the Philippines is only possible by translocal and transnational engagements. The main vehicle for this goal is the newly created Leon Hub for Global and Area Studies, with the JFW collection an important supplementary pillar. To encourage serious readership and scholarly production out of the JFW collection, the School of Social Sciences unveils the JFW Research Fellowship. The fellowship will offer a 4-week residency to Southeast Asian scholars to use the JFW collection of the Ateneo de Manila University. It is designed to support the university's thrust of bridging cultural divides and integral ecology. On behalf of the School of Social Sciences, I thank Professor Warren for his generous donation and the Department of History for leading us in the welcoming of this donation. It is my earnest wish that through the JFW Research Fellowship, the JFW collection will be a gift that will keep on giving. Research fellows and other users giving us a richer understanding of our country by offering us a wider appreciation of our translocal and transnational relatedness. Thank you everyone and welcome to the School of Social Sciences.
Dear Jim, greetings from Sweden and congratulations on the republication of the Sulu Zone. For me, I think it's been an immensely important book. I picked it up sometime in the 1990s as I was a PhD student, and I read it with much interest, and I think it influenced me to take an interest in piracy, which I subsequently did. But I think it also influenced me in a way to see Southeast Asian history from new perspectives and see how the history of the region could be written, even from colonial archives, but with indigenous perspectives. And I think in that respect, I think the book is still a very important contribution to global history, even before the field came into its own, so to say. I think it's groundbreaking when it came in the early 1980s, and I still think it's a role model for how global history can be written from multiple archives, multiple voices and perspectives, and how we can integrate the local with the regional and the global. So all the best and congratulations again.
Hi, this is Jojo Benales. I remember when I was writing my dissertation in Cornell, having Jim Warren's The Sulu Zone on my side. Jim's book was my guide in trying to understand why Muslim societies reacted to American colonial rule in ways different from those in the central and northern Philippines. More importantly, Jim's book made me realize the centrality and the cosmopolitanism of communities of southern Mindanao. So thank you, Jim, for what you've written. It's a classic. I continue to read it, continue to use it as a guide in understanding contemporary Mindanao politics. More importantly, thank you for training a new generation of scholars that do not look at the Philippines from the center but from the margins. Pat Takuda's dissertation is classic Warren. Thank you and best wishes.
Hi, this is Cherry Kizon in Seton Hall University in New Jersey. It's fall 2021, and I am here again teaching students face-to-face. Congratulations to you, Jim, for the reissue of your book, The Sulu Zone, which has certainly influenced my thinking. I believe even before I knew they were your ideas as an undergrad at the University of the Philippines. And it's shaped my research concerning the indigenous peoples and their textiles in Mindanao as I think about this polyethnic space, right, that's not defined by categories of race or religion or language, but is a complex interaction of ways by which folks organize their relationships with each other. It was a pleasure to meet you in 2013 for the first time as an awardee for the Grant Goodman Prize for the Philippine Studies Group. I look forward to using your book as I teach a course in Peoples and Cultures of Southeast Asia next semester to introduce your ideas to an American undergraduate audience. I hope we see you once again face-to-face, whether in the Philippines or in the US, and we look forward to more writings from you. Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Ollie Charbonneau. I am at the University of Glasgow here in Scotland, where I teach and research on American history. Firstly, I want to give my congratulations to Jim Warren for the much-deserved reissue of the Sulu Zone, which I first encountered, I guess, comparatively recently, given its now long life, about 8 years ago when I was doing my PhD research and writing on U.S. colonialism in the southern Philippines. And the Sulu Zone was one of these key texts that really helped me to understand and indeed enriched my understanding of the incredibly sort of dynamic and shifting realities of this sort of region that Jim identifies as the Sulu Zone. And I think it continues to be an impressive work, not only as a still a key text on this area of the world, but also in the way that it sort of anticipated a lot of the major preoccupations of the coming decades within global history in its own sort of elegant and very sort of rigorous way. So congrats again.
This year, Ateneo de Manila University Press put out 3 anniversary editions, 220th and today the 40th anniversary edition of the classic Sulu Zone by James Warren. Sulu Zone, as has been said quite extensively throughout this program, when first published in 1981 was pioneering and therefore a landmark title. It gave us an indelible geographical, historical, and cultural picture of that border zone as certainly not homogeneous, but nuanced and layered in its complex interactions with China and the West between 1768 and 1898. For the first time, it showed how the often neglected men and women who were forest dwellers, highlanders, and slaves, people who every day worked as fishers, raiders, divers, and traders, responded to the seismic global economic and cultural flows and interactions caused by cross-cultural trade and European dominance. The stories of these members of society, as those of the rulers and the officers, are a crucial part of the history of Southeast Asia. They balance off the region's and the nation's historical record. Well-loved novels and children's books come in gorgeous jackets and luxury anniversary editions that their old readers, as well as the new, collect and cherish. Harry Potter would be a recent example, and they keep coming up with new editions. Lord of the Rings and the Penguin Classics. Academic or scholarly classics don't need gold-edged pages or embossed covers, but yes, come with new covers, but most importantly, new prefaces and introductions which kind of look back at the afterlife of every first edition and take stock of how they have influenced or even shaped the area studies to which they belong. Anniversary editions bring backlist titles to a new generation, revive their influence, and remind them of how these classics broke ground. These that are considered primers, meaning 1, fundamental books which elegantly introduce a field of study, meaning 2, the first coat of paint to prevent absorption of subsequent layers of false or faulty arguments, or defend it against the rust of old and static ideas. When I first met James Warren in late January 2018 at our office, he was escorted by historians Pat Tacudao and no less than Noel Rodriguez, who graciously wrote the foreword to this 40th anniversary edition. We all assumed then that it was originally published by New Day Press here. I didn't even think we would have a hard time securing a waiver to proceed with our new edition, as the director who took over from the eminent Gloria Rodriguez was a close friend. In a quick message, however, my friend said she had retired and I had to be patient with the new head as she was more a manager than a publisher. And true enough, it took months and only in February this year that we finally received the waiver. When we requested Jim to send us the Word or PDF file so we could begin our production, what he sent was a National University of Singapore press file. And when I asked its director, Peter Schopert, if they did a reprint, he also could not say if their 2007 edition was indeed a reprint of the New Day title. As we were about to use their files, this then had to be covered by a reprint arrangement with NUS Press. I know this back and forth is confusing to follow. Fortunately, our head of editorial, Julian, had a copy at home of the original 1981 edition, copyrighted by Singapore University Press, perhaps the old name of the NUS Press. The 1985 New Day edition was therefore a local reprint. Amazing how books travel across time and borders. The sociologist and great thinker Max Weber said in the early 20th century that a scholar's vocation is to take on a task that no one believes is worth doing. And when that succeeds, the scholar knows that the work will generate more questions, answerable only by new scholarship that eventually will surpass it. It is in fact the destiny and the point of a scholar's work to be left behind. But that is also what it means to be a pioneer, to think ahead, to be the first to ask what might seem like a small question and dedicate your life's work to it. This anniversary edition reminds us of the questions this book raised then and answered, and now at this juncture, what new questions, new insights will come up from another of the book's many layers that our new realities might push up. After all, they say a classic is a book that never finishes saying what it means to say. Thank you, Dr. James Warren, for the trust and for Sulu Zone.
Hi, this is Eric Taliakoto from Cornell University. Just a quick message of congratulations both to the Ateneo de Manila Press and also to Jim Warren on the 40th anniversary of his landmark book, The Sulu Zone. This is just an amazing book. I still remember reading this as a young person in the library in Singapore, me going through this book over several hours and thinking to myself, how am I going to ever see this book again? The thought actually went through my mind, can I get this book out of the library without paying for it? And I'm glad I didn't steal the book from the library. That would have been wrong and terrible. But it engendered such a strong reaction in me at that time that I still remember it now, several decades later. So I really want to pass on my congratulations both to the press and to Jim Warren for this fantastic, fantastic book. It really changed the way we think about this part of the world, and for many historians, it helped them think about history generally in a very different way. Congratulations.
I have had the privilege of knowing Jim for 13 years. The first time was in July 2008, when a colleague at the National Library, Singapore, Dr. Eric Holmberg, where I was doing a Lee Kong Shan Fellowship, paved the way for me to reach out to Jim with the intention of undertaking a postdoctoral degree. I have experienced that, at least in my life, there were people who, by opening one door, allowed another door to be opened. And academic life becomes a series of doors. Some that lead to somewhere with another door to some place, and some that lead to not so large rooms, but always you move. This is what I have learned in my work under Jim's tutelage. I am very grateful for all the support and trust that Jim gave me, an inexperienced scholar in 2008. His commitment to Filipino scholars and to understanding the Philippines through historical lens is unparalleled. Congratulations on the 40th anniversary edition launch of the Sulu Zone, and cheers to Professor James Warren.
I first met Jim when I was taking down notes of the lantakas lined up on the steps of the Museo de Ejército in Madrid a long time ago. And when he saw me, he comes up to me and says, I did the same thing. I think of Jim as working on a changing Rubik's Cube of history, looking at the subjects, responding to new situations and constrained opportunities from ever-changing new dimensions of time. Jim has inspired me to look into new modes and sources of research, and ultimately to challenge my own long-held presumptions, assumptions, and habits of the mind, of which I'm often quite unconscious of, and to develop new perspectives and to explore new ways of doing things. Thank you, Jim.
Talking about Jim in 1 minute is quite a challenge, so I will stick to one story how Jim has made me a stronger person. Mentally, he made me a stronger person by teaching and showing me the importance of kindness and caring about those that are often overlooked. But Jim also contributed to making me a stronger person physically. That's because when I did my fieldwork in and around Semporna, I often met people who wanted to know more about the history of the region or the history of the people living in that region. And at the time I was carrying a copy of Jim's book, The Sulu Zone, so I left it with one of my friends there. Before I returned the next time, my friend had sent me a request saying, "Oh, can you bring more copies of the book, because I have more people who would like to have one." So I started to carry more books over there. And over the years I carried not only copies of the Sulu Zone, but of many of other Jim's books, and gave them to people in the area. I'm not sure how many books I carried over the years, but I still remember the heavy backpacks I always arrived in Semporna.
James Warren inspired me to go beyond his piratical expeditions and search for the surviving Samuels of the 1858 exile to Isabela in Cagayan Valley. Within these two generations, these deportados were almost completely integrated into Isabela inhabitants, but certainly with memories of their fields, working under the moonlight and missing the current of the seas. So we walked over the very hot stones and calling Assalamualaikum, alaikum assalam, we were going this way and that way. And suddenly Flora Flores, 82 years old, answered me when I said, Assalamualaikum, and she said, alaikum assalam. Magic, I had found my Muslims in Isabela, and I had put an end to my book, Crease of Valor, for my master's degree. I further searched for the Samuels of the 10th century in Cabadbaran, in Agusan del Norte, and particularly in Butuan. My doctorate degree came to an end, and 6 years after, I had written The Samuels in History and Legend, published by the University of Santo Tomas. Thank you, Mr. Warren, for being an inspiration.
Jim, hello. Congratulations on this milestone, this latest milestone in your career, the 40th anniversary of the Sulu Zone. I was asked to share an anecdote about the book and its impact. And what came to my mind is the number of occasions that I've been with you over the last decade or so, traveling overseas. And as you do when you go to conferences or seminars, you always meet new people from right around the world. And I really have lost count of the number of times I've been with you when you were introduced to somebody for the first time, and immediately whoever that person was recognized you as the author of this book, The Sulu Zone. And I think that more than anything speaks to the impact that it's had globally over the past 40 years. So congratulations to you. And just very quickly, if I can thank our friends, your friends and my friends at Ateneo de Manila University for the opportunity to contribute to this short video. Thank you.
Hello, Jim. It's an honor for me to have been invited to send you a message and to pay honor to a man whose work and life I've admired all these years. I remember seeing you for the first time way back in the 80s as a young instructor at the University of the Philippines at Diliman, where I remember seeing you wearing a beret. And that image has remained in me, for during all these years. Happy to have had the opportunity to have worked with you and to be with you in conferences like the one at Alcalá de Henares. Well, unfortunately, it's remembered for the 9/11 where we had our ICOFIL conference there. Then years later at the Ateneo de Manila University in 2018, and in 2019 together at Yogyakarta, Indonesia for a conference. Look forward to listening to your talk again when they relaunch your seminal work on the Sulu Zone. And I've never had a copy of that because when I was a young professor, I couldn't afford it. And when I could afford it, it was already gone. And so I'm so happy that it's coming out, and definitely I'll be getting a copy. Well, thank you again, and I hope to see you soon. Wishing you good health and success as always. Thank you. Bye.
Hi, Jim. Greetings from Madison, Wisconsin. First of all, congratulations on the reprint of your seminal and very relevant book on the Sulu Zone, as well as for your many other contributions on study of the Philippines and of course, Southeast Asia more generally. I want to first just kind of remind you of the moment that we first met. You may recall this. It was during the early 1970s, sa panahon ni Marcos, where we were both introduced to each other by the then director of the National Archives of the Philippines, our old friend Domingo Abella. This was, as you might recall, a very historical moment for all of us to be in the archives together. However, one of my fondest moments of kind of greeting you and meeting you out of context was, however, in September of 2001. When I encountered you sitting on a bench in the Plaza de Alcalá de Henares. This was, of course, during the Eurofil conference. As I recall, we had a very lively conversation touching on life and research in the Philippine studies. But this was, of course, only a day before the 9/11 attacks on the New York World Trade Center, a memorable day that certainly disrupted our academic endeavors at that time. So basically, this is just a hi and congratulations to you, and I hope that all is well with you and you are in good spirits, and it will stay that way. See you later.
It is a delight and honor for me to be at this ceremony. I happen to be in Italy now, some 6 time zones away from Sulu, Perth, or Manila. Luckily, distance seems not to be a constraint at the moment, considering that Jim Warren's works ably span several time zones: China, England, India, Sulawesi, Sulu, and beyond. His books have a way of stretching our gaze, of nudging us to accept that the world we live in is in fact wider than we customarily sense it to be. The Sulu Zone, the masterpiece, transports us to many places. Remarkably, it gives us a keen sense of how the places interrelate. Communities separated by vast waters are shown to be, in fact, significantly interlinked. The seas and oceans that seem at first glance as insuperable barriers turn out to be what allow encounters and transactions. The interaction among communities was uneven, with centers and peripheries, and within communities themselves, there was unevenness, more precisely, inequalities. Trade and the social conditions that sustained it generated integration of economies and societies, but so too disintegration of captive communities resulting from the massive dislocation of those referred to in the book as slaves. To sustain trade, the Tausug needed to sustain the steady flow of labor obtained through long-distance maritime raiding. It was the captive people who were the fisheries, rice fields, birds' nest caves, and the sea vessels that carried the goods and captives. In a sense, the Sulu Zone was the physical space rendered in the narrative as expansive, though connected. But importantly, it was also what we might call the human space, the social space inhabited by humans. Nay, more than that, it was the very human beings that occupied it, indeed, who constituted it. In his works, Jim Warren has manifested deep solidarity with those who in historical narratives are often excluded: prostitutes, rickshaw pullers, harvesters of bird's nest, pearl, mother of pearl, and tripang, among others. Those slaves who were at once the exploited ones and the signifiers of social status among those who owned or benefited from them. no less than Lives for Inclusive Histories. All this to say that Jim Warren, through the years, has placed us in indelible debt for his rigorous and creative scholarship. And today, through the donation of his book collection, for yet another massive investment in the next generation. Thank you, Jim.
I think that many of the people featured in those videos, in those messages, many of those, I think that we share many of the stories that they have, that sentiment of gratitude and respect, Jim, for your scholarship and your fellowship. We do have a few more of these surprise messages in store for you, but for now, I think everyone is eager to hear from you. If you have questions for Professor Warren, you may type them in the chat box. We ask that you please include your name and affiliation so that we can attribute the questions properly. Now then, finally, the part everyone has been waiting for, the circle, threads, and encounters. Professor Warren, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, and good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everybody who has registered for this book launch, and welcome. And before I go any further, to all my colleagues and friends who have spoken briefly about aspects of my work, I just want to say thank you very much. It's a real surprise. So thank you. Yeah. I want to begin by thanking all those individuals, especially at the Ateneo de Manila University Press and the staff of the history department at the university, as well as the dean of the School of Social Science and the vice president of the university for their support for both the book launch and everything else that is associated with this event. I owe a debt of gratitude, both personal and professional, to Karina Velasco as the director of the Ateneo de Manila University Press, and Peter Chopit, director of the National University of Singapore Press, for their fine collaborative effort and mutual support and encouragement for this project. I also wish to thank Julian de la Serna, head of the editorial and production team at the press, and Nadine Hendrika E. Legaspi, an editor on that team, for their expert advice and support. I also want to thank the celebrated artist and graphic designer, Felix Mago Miguel, for the cover design of this special anniversary edition of the book, and Dr. Noel Rodriguez, a good friend and former chair of the history department at the Ateneo, for writing the foreword for this 40th anniversary edition. I also want to take this opportunity to especially thank also members of the history department at Ateneo, especially Dr. Pat Dakodow and Father Joey Cruz, for their outstanding organization and coordination of this book launch. It goes without saying that I am also indebted to the many colleagues, former students and friends, including my PhD supervisor, Tony Reed. I didn't expect that you would be all speaking. I just wanted to say about the book, and I just wanted to say thank you for all registering and attending this book launch, and thank you for your valuable comments, criticisms, and encouragement over the past 4 decades concerning my work related to the zone and more generally. There are far too many colleagues' names to mention here, except to say thank you and note that many of them are acknowledged in this new special 40th anniversary edition of the book. I also wish to take this opportunity once again to express my gratitude to my wife, Carol, and daughter, Kristen, for their help and encouragement They both have also invested time on the subject matter of the book as friends, intellectual companions, and critics over the past 4 decades. Now let me turn directly to the content of the talk itself. And I want to begin with the symbol of the circle. John Fiolandia, the widely celebrated Lakota Sioux healer and holy man of the Pan-Amerindian movement of the early 1970s, stresses in his teachings that we live in a world of symbols and images where the commonplace and spiritual are one. The Amerindian symbol that signifies this mystical belief in our oneness with creation is the circle, the sacred hoop of nature, which according to Landio wants things to be round, to be together and forever. The circle as a spiritual sign constitutes both a symbol and a reality, signifying an affirmation of faith and a history stretching across millennia, as well as expressing the journey of our lives. I want to invoke this power dash symbol, this power dash full symbol at this book launch as a sign signifying an effort to start closing the circle of my life and work by returning today to my intellectual home in the Philippines at the Ateneo de Manila University, the special place that first supported and encouraged my work on the Sulu zone many, many years ago. Now let me turn to threads and encounters. First, let me say once again, it is good to be here, albeit virtually, among friends, family, and esteemed colleagues. This book launch signifies one way of mapping aspects of a life and the birth of a book on time. Of course, there are other equally important ways of marking the passage of time in relation to our lives and work, namely through our families, friends, and the significant other people, encounters, and moments in our lives that have made a book like this one possible. Aspects of my work on the Zone book and the days have already been presented elsewhere, including in the revised preface to this 40th anniversary 3rd edition. However, the details of the birth and the framing of the book remain somewhat elusive and fleeting. Here on this wonderful occasion, the time frames and turning points have shifted as past, present, and future flow into one another like the currents of water. I believe, like Morris West, Australian novelist and playwright, and one of the great storytellers of the 20th century, that all the saving graces in our lives and work are presented to us in random moments and encounters of singular, albeit simple, revelation. The interrogating smile of a formidable professor, the remarkable local knowledge and confidence of a consummate Samuel Fisher navigating his lepa on a pitch black night through a reef-strewn sea, a little nameless, albeit crucial act of kindness from a powerful Philippine administrator. Why Karen Armstrong, one of the foremost scholars of world religion, refers to as, quote, spots of time, moments and encounters in my life, our lives, sometimes nameless and unremembered, that helped me to understand what lay behind the birth of the book over the years. When you find yourself amid the relentless circulations and flow of the encounters, moments, and events that make up your life, how does one sort out the myriad moments and encounters and attribute meaning to the seemingly trivial and apparently important? To understand in part the basis for the direction that my life and the framing of this book has taken, I want to share with you several important encounters, 3 to be precise among others, that can help explain the background to how and why the Sulu Zone was conceived. These disconnected moments and encounters helped me to begin to chart the course for the direction of my life and PhD thesis, the basis of this book. These chance encounters in diverse individuals which are finally connected here, are all disparate parts of the expression lying behind the birth of the book, and part of the inadvertent support that enabled me to frame and write it. But they did not provide answers to the inevitable question of what I was going to do with my life and work once the thesis was finished. Here it is my memory that orders the seemingly disparate encounters and moments of connection that make up aspects of the birth of the book and myself. Encounters that had important personal significance and became part of the chain of association in helping frame some parts of the book and one of the most important moments of my life. Miyazawa Kenji, the late Taisho and early Showa period novelist, poet, and Buddhist philosopher, thought of all persons in such moments as being connected to one another as if by threads in a metaphorical net or web of interdependence, which exists not only in space, but also in time in our lives. I now want to briefly discuss three encounters, three individuals, and three distinct settings between 1969 and 1973 that directly affected the birth of the Zone book. The first was with a remarkable Samuel Fisher and spirit medium on the northeast coast of Sabah, East Malaysia in 1969. The second with a renowned professor of history in central upstate New York at Cornell University in 1970. And the last with a Filipino medical doctor and pioneering archivist in 1973 in Manila. I am convinced that these chance encounters were integral to the making of the book and our, namely Carol, my wife's journey, our journey, as it unfolded in Sabah, the United States, the Philippines, and consequently in Australia, which has been our home now for over half a century. My initial desire to write the history of the zone did not begin with academic books and formal training. It stemmed in part from my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer on the east coast of North Borneo, living in a Samal Bajau village of maritime nomadic boat dwellers and a semi-sedentary population, a pariah people in varying stages of adaptation to a house-dwelling way of life in the latter part of the 1960s, when the modern state of Malaysia emerged and the Bajau Laut became progressively further marginalized and impoverished. My wife, Carol, and I, we were then newly married, first learned of the Samal Bajau Laut and the economic and political landscape of the maritime world of the southern Philippines and eastern Indonesia when we received our Peace Corps posting in December 1967. In the official letter assigning us to Sabah on the east coast of Borneo was the following paragraph. Semporna is a unique place, Bajau, Muslim, and cynically beautiful. Many people regard it as an unfriendly place, but I think this prejudice results from an only superficial encounter with the people there. If you live in the fullest sense of the word among them, I think you will find the Bajau friendly people. End quote. We lived for 2 years as Peace Corps volunteers in Semporna on the east coast of North Borneo between 1967 and 1969. The period from January to November 1969 spent in Kampong Bango Bango, a Samal Bajau Laut village consisting of a flotilla of boat dwellers and a semi-sedentary population of Bajau Laut in varying stages of adaptation to a house-dwelling way of life was particularly memorable. It was the rapid abandonment of sea nomadism, a lifestyle which had characterized the Samal Bajau Laut as a people and from which they drew their sense of identity, which first motivated my interest in Southeast Asian history. Sea nomads like the Bajau Laut have been involved for centuries with land-based polities in kingdoms in Southeast Asia, procuring maritime commodities, facilitating regional trade, and comprising the naval forces of sedentary populations. The Samal-Bajo Laut were a pre-literate society, and they had no written language to speak of at the time when we moved to the village. All their history, the deep, abiding ecological and spiritual knowledge, was orally transmitted. In the first several months of living there, whenever we inquired about the past, about fishing techniques in the sea, about spiritual beliefs and healing practices, the same name kept being mentioned. All their history and culture were locked inside the head, and the words and deeds of this man that everybody seemed to both revere and fear. Young women sometimes even became ill at the mention of his name or his impending return from a distant fishing journey. But he had been nowhere to be seen since we arrived in the village several months earlier. Very few were blessed or burdened with the quintessential collective memory that he carried inside him. The thoughts from other places, other journeys across the seas, and other times, even distant times. The sadness was that other young men in their prime of his generation were already drifting away from the sea to build roads through the jungle for the timber companies starting to take down the great forests of North Borneo, or working mock cargo as stevedores on the docks of Sendakan and Tawau. They were starting to be lost along with their outlying age-old ecological adaptation and their history too. Then one afternoon in early March, while returning home from the school on the land where we taught, the first encounter occurred. I suddenly stopped as we walked down the long rickety bridge to our little house built over the water and turned to Carol and said, "He is here." There was not a soul to be seen on the 800-yard long bridge or outside their small stilt houses. Nobody was visible in any of the boats moored near the bridge and around the village. There was an eerie, deafening silence. We walked quickly and carefully to the front of our house near the end of the village, and then I saw it. The tide was up, and there, tied to a bridge post, was this magnificent lepa lepa, over 45 feet long, more directly opposite the entrance to our house. I kneeled down to peer into the houseboat, and a remarkable man, 6'2" tall, wearing the green loose flowing pants, a sawal of a jinn or spirit medium, stood up, and as I quickly started to stand, he forcefully declared, "Aku Garani, I am Garani." His Samal name derived from the word Barani in Malay, meaning brave or courageous, and I thought, yes, indeed. This encounter on the bridge, the first of many with Garani, made me want to investigate the historical antecedents to the contemporary social issues and problems that were forcing him, his family, and other Samal Bajo Laut to abandon the sea and their maritime nomadic way of life, and from which they derived their sense of identity in the Sulu zone. The search for the historical antecedents to contemporary social issues and problems among the Samal Bajo Laut, whose maritime nomadic culture was being inexorably extinguished by local political and economic developments, subsequently involved me in the postgraduate study of the nature of the interaction of a relatively weak quasi-colonial agency, the North Borneo Chartered Company, and the maritime nomadic people of the northeast coast of Borneo between 1878 and 1909. Much of the historical research had been done earlier during our vacation, shortly after we had finished our period of service in Sabah as Peace Corps volunteers. The time is now March 1970, and the place is Athens, Ohio. I was in the final stages of finishing my MA thesis and degree at Ohio University. Our daughter, Kristen, now a professor of wildlife, zoological, and conservation medicine, entered the world in late December 1970. The birth of our daughter changed my thinking about the possibility of embarking on further postgraduate study for a doctorate. I was concerned that I would not be able to provide properly for my family on a PhD scholarship that would most likely finish before I would complete my doctoral dissertation. However, the three professors on my postgraduate committee strongly encouraged me, nevertheless, to apply to a number of graduate schools in the United States, Michigan, Yale, and Cornell. I decided then also to apply for several PhD scholarships overseas, including international awards offered by the University of London, Monash University, and the Australian National University. I was interested in the Oxbridge system because the PhD scholarships offered were research-based and did not require any further formal coursework. I had a reasonable sense by then of the thesis that I wanted to investigate for a doctorate about the making of the Sulu zone. The choice to opt for Australia at that time, while not necessarily easy, became quite straightforward in the end for reasons that will become clear shortly. It allowed me the ultimate practical experience of passing over into another culture and society situated on the margin of Southeast Asia, and the chance of studying and working in a different system of education, which at the postgraduate level primarily emphasized research and participation in a variety of intra-university interdisciplinary seminars. I was accepted into the postgraduate history programs at Michigan and Cornell, while Harry Bender at Yale provided wise advice, stating my research interests were not purely historical and would most likely be better served by applying elsewhere in the sister discipline of anthropology. The next moment in this bygone pre-computer era concerns receipt of an aerogram dated 18 March 1971 from Anthony Tony Reed, who had recently arrived in the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies at the Australian National University. Part of Tony's aerogram reads as follows: I trust you received my 2 telegrams of 15 March, quote, will cable decision by 20th and 18 March. Scholarship recommended by faculty board. Confirmation next week should normally be formal. The position is that after some delay caused by a temporary financial crisis and debate whether any scholarships could be awarded, the faculty board of the Research School of Pacific Studies approved the award of the scholarship to you. This has, of course, to be subject to the satisfactory completion of your MA, which I gather now is only a formality. We naturally hope very much you will be coming here. Should you decide, on the other hand, to accept a different offer, for example, from Cornell, we would hope to be advised of that fairly quickly, as the competition for places is considerable. I felt compelled, based on Tony Reed's letter, to make the long trip to Cornell to meet Oliver Walters, the celebrated author of early Indonesian commerce and the fall of Srivijaya in Malay history at first hand. I had been offered a full 4-year scholarship in the history department at Cornell, but I was still worried that I would not be able to finish the thesis I had in mind within the stipulated period of the scholarship because of the additional coursework required as part of the PhD program at Cornell. I needed to speak to Walters about my concerns in related matters. So Carol, now a professor of anthropology, and I drove the 800 miles from Athens, Ohio to Ithaca, New York in the dead of winter with our 15-month-old daughter in a bassinet in the back seat of our 2-door compact rear-engine Chevrolet Corvair. After an 800-mile nonstop trip, we pulled up at dusk about an hour outside Ithaca in swirling snow and stayed the night in a small roadside motel. On a bright, crisp winter morning early the following day, we drove the remaining short distance to Cornell. Oliver Walters, who came to academic life late, having spent 20 years from 1937 to 1957 working in the Malayan civil service, was expecting me. The second encounter occurred on the steps of McGraw Hall, where I met Professor Walters for the first time. He was wearing a fedora hat, a trench coat, a pipe clenched between his teeth, and he was carrying an Olivetti portable typewriter. He said hello to me and then beckoned me to follow me into the building. We went up several flights of stairs to his office. He opened the door to his long rectangular office with very high ceilings, and sitting at the front of the office at a separate desk was Bill O'Malley and Tony Milner, who were having their Dutch lesson, two of Professor Walter's PhD students, and both of them subsequently would return to Australia by the mid-1970s. Professor Walters beckoned me to the opposite end of the room and asked me to sit down opposite him at his desk. As soon as we sat down, then there was a barrage of questions, and they came thick and fast. He immediately took off the bookshelf behind him Horatio de la Costa's wonderful book about the Jesuits in the Philippines and asked my opinion of it. He then asked me how many languages did I read and speak. I did not know at this time that he had been an officer in the psychological warfare branch during the Malayan emergency, directly involved in interrogating prisoners in Pahang at that time. My impression was he appeared to me to be like a spring under tremendous tension. The questions were asked one after another in rapid fire manner, especially about my interests in Mindanao and Sulu, which I explained to him. And then he explained that, of course, if I were to come to Cornell, that I would have to set these interests aside for at least 2 years and concentrate on learning Vietnamese. Walter stated, quote, "We all have our parochial interests. I would like you to learn Vietnamese, and after 2 years, if you are still interested in Mindanao and Sulu, you can return to the area." At that time, he had two postgraduate students, Ann Lindsay Rebbe and Ronaldo Aleto, who were both working on important aspects of the history of both Mindanao and Sulu. I was not aware of this, nor was I aware of the shift that had recently occurred in Walter's thinking and work, namely moving away from the early maritime world of insular Southeast Asia towards untangling aspects of the earlier historical relationship between Vietnam and China. I listened attentively. I smiled and thanked him, walked down several flights of steps out of McGraw Hall to our parked car. Carol rolled down the window of the car with our daughter still sleeping peacefully in the bassinet. Just over an hour had elapsed since we had arrived. I smiled and said, "We are going to Australia." Now let me turn to the third encounter. Carol, Chris, and I arrived in Manila in late 1973, shortly after I completed my archival research in the Netherlands and France. We had spent several days in transit in Copenhagen and flew from Denmark on the SAS Trans-Asian Express to Bangkok, where Chris contracted a skin rash. This meant upon arrival in Manila, she was placed in quarantine and locked down in our rental apartment in Amita for 2 weeks until she was well again and given a clean bill of health. Shortly after our arrival in Manila, I went to the Philippine National Archive to introduce myself to Dr. Domingo Abella, the director of the archive, a physician by training who was also devoted to history. I was surprised to learn that he was expecting me. Bruce Cruikshank, who I had met earlier in the year at the Archivo de Indias in Seville, had taken the liberty of mentioning to Dr. Abella that I would be arriving in the Philippines shortly, namely in October, just before Bruce left Manila for Samar to work on his history of the island for his PhD in the Comparative Tropical History program at the University of Wisconsin. Bruce was following in the footsteps of Al McCoy, working on Iloilo, Mike Cullinane working on Cebu, and Norman Owen working on Bicol. They had all done preliminary work in the Philippine National Archive and then headed south to conduct ethnographic and historical research at the province and community level in southern Luzon and the Visayas. The archive had been recently relocated from the old Balibi prison to the new National Library building, and the archive shared approximately one half of the building. The archive reading room and office of the director, Dr. Abelia, was located then on the ground floor of the long modern building. My initial impression upon entering the ground floor foyer of the archive was that I noticed three women dressed in black quietly sitting there as if in mourning, protesting on behalf of their husbands who had lost their jobs at the archive. My initial impression of Dr. Abelia was of a big, well-dressed, imposing man who sat at a large desk stationed at the head of the reading room. There was an army revolver placed on the desk and a framed picture hung on the wall directly behind the desk of a matador about to deliver the coup de grace to a fighting bull. I asked Dr. Abelia after several days what was the significance of the painting and the gun he placed on his desk each morning. His answer was as follows. The painting signified a person like him fighting the bull of corruption, and the gun was a power-full sign of just how serious he was about cleaning up an incompetent workforce in the archive. The only other researchers working in the archive daily during the 3 months I was there were Faye Mangahas and a woman named Karen, both history majors from the University of the Philippines. Dr. Abelia took an active interest in my research, and I mentioned to him the importance of some of the sources I was encountering, especially the significance of several sets of the statements of the fugitive captives of the Sulu Sultanate. I was extremely excited when I discovered the first bundle of statements because I knew that I had finally found a sufficient number of them to make my argument with conviction about the significant role of the banyago, or slave, in the economy and society of the Sultanate and elsewhere within the confines of the zone. The third encounter occurred less than a month later when Carol and Chris met me on the archive steps for lunch for the first time. I introduced them to Dr. Abelia, who liked them very much, especially our daughter. He had not realized that I was married and had a child, and went out of his way after meeting them to make sure I received all the help necessary so I could complete my work properly and on time. I kept turning up more and more captive statements, and Dr. Abelia made sure that my orders for legajos were delivered promptly, so my work stayed on schedule. After 2 months, however, Dr. Abelia began to inquire at weekly intervals how much more time I needed to complete my work. I was finally able to say to him just 1 more week. He smiled and said that was fine. I finished up the following week and thanked him for his support. We packed our belongings and returned to Australia, and I embarked upon a 14-month period to write my thesis. The week after we left Manila, Dr. Abelia suddenly closed the archive for 9 months for a range of reasons. I was most fortunate because he had taken a direct interest in my work and family and thought both were important. He had specifically waited till I had completed my research before he closed the doors of the archive. But other overseas researchers working in the provinces were not so fortunate, depending on how much they had managed to accomplish in Manila prior to the shutdown, like Al McCoy, Mike Cullinane, Bruce Cruikshank, and Norman Owen. The research patterns on which the thesis in this book are based revealed some unavoidable conclusions about the nature of Southeast Asian history and the meaning and elaboration of ethnic diversity in Southeast Asia. It is the trans-historical, transcultural, and transdisciplinary methodological approach of the Zone book, linking detailed research of a local situation to wider global, regional, economic systems and issues, with particular reference to agency or experience in inverted commas that underpin this work, or how a thalassography can implicitly resolve into micro-sociological projects. Thus, an examination of the structure of life of the slaves in the zone at the microsocial level challenged certain generalizations which have been made about the nature and historical evolution of the Sulu Sultanate and its peoples. In addition, the long historical period of 130 years, 1768 to 1898, revealed ways in which the global economy, trade commodities, population growth, environmental sustainability, economic transformation, colonial warfare, and state formation were all reflected in the microcosm of the slave's life in the Sulu zone. We arrived in Canberra on 1 October 1971, and I submitted my thesis by research only on October 1, 1975. 4 years to the day of our arrival down under, or the place the Spanish explorer Quiros referred to as La Tierra del Espíritu Santo in 1606. Oliver Walters would be present for the oral defense and examination of my thesis in March 1976, which he liked very much. Australia is our home. Over the past 50 years, it is where we have raised our family and planted trees, and where we have written virtually all our books. But the intellectual and social foundations, much of the inspiration, training, and core values can also be found in the United States and Southeast Asia over the past half century among family, friends, my former teachers, colleagues, and students. I would now just like to say something briefly about the donation. I've been asked to do this concerning my professional library. Books have always played a fundamental role in my life. When I was growing up and not outside playing in the woods, cradling a lacrosse stick, kicking a soccer ball at a nearby field, or swinging a golf club, I would go to the town library in search of books to read. I knew the location of the library and how to get there by the time I was 8 years old. Some of my fondest memories are connected to that small library, which took me an hour to reach on foot, as well as to many others far larger and older around the world that have stored the books and documents that have fired my imagination over the past half century. When students stand inside my office and library for the first time, especially the current generation, they get a powerful sense of who I am, and not just who I am now, but also who I have been. My office and library, inextricably connected to one another as product and fate, is also my principal writing room, where I work surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Books are a wonderful thing to have in your office and at home. It is my passion for books about history, ethnography, and literature, and my vocation as a teacher and historian that has led me to amass a professional collection, one based on the courses I have taught and the major research projects I have explored over the years. The search to find certain books in the past has taken me to legendary bookstores, landmarks that were always worth making the effort to visit, like Moe's Books in Berkeley, Paul's Bookstore on State Street in Madison, the Atticus Bookstore and Cafe in New Haven. These three bookstores are all located on the edge of the campuses of renowned American universities, namely Berkeley, University of Wisconsin, and Yale. There was also the Kitazawa bookstore, founded in 1902, always jam-packed, selling a wide variety of secondhand and rare books in the Chiyoda area of Tokyo, again located near several universities. I have held on to most of the books I have bought since I first began to teach, and they are all part of my past. But now it is time to part with most of them in a phased manner over the next 3 to 5 years. The books, documents, and correspondence in my professional library tell us something about the history of my reading preferences, and practices as a historian. They can be reasonably regarded as a basic source of information, not only about my reading history, but also about wider patterns related to my teaching and practice of history, especially particular innovative ideas that have been central to my research over the past 5 decades. Now let me turn briefly and just outline the content of the library for you. there are over 2,200 books, and they cover areas concerned with the teaching and writing of history, especially with historical method and historiography, of course, on slavery and piracy in a global comparative perspective, on the history of Southeast Asia, especially insular Southeast Asia, on the history of the Singapore and the Chinese overseas, of course, on the history of the Philippines, environmental history and disaster studies, Native American history. There are between 25 and 30 PhD and honors theses, some very rare books, original editions, primarily in Spanish, about the history of Mindanao and Sulu, encyclopedias on Asian history, on social science, and on maritime history, handbooks, guides, and repositories to archives, libraries around the world, especially in the United States, Europe, and Southeast Asia. 70 lever arch files containing typed transcripts of translated primary source material and Xerox copies of originals relating to the Singapore coroner's inquests and inquiries, relating to the testimonial of the cautivos fugados, or captive statements, primary documents also about the Aranan and Balangini and Moro piracy emanating from England, Spain, and the Philippines. And then there are documents relating to specifically to slavery and the Moro problem, particularly various personal collections from the Library of Congress and U.S. National Archives that Oliver Charbonneau especially would be familiar with, the papers of Leonard Wood, John Pershing, Tasker Bliss, Henry Allen, Robert Bullard, Frank McCoy, Hugh Scott, William Brownson, and the Wilkes and Briscoe papers. And of course, there are documents relating to typhoons and natural disasters in the Philippines from the Philippine National Archive and from Spain. There are several hundred reels of microfilm, again, relating to Singapore, as well as to slavery and raiding from archives in the Netherlands, France, Spain, and the Philippines. There are document containers between 25 and 30 relating to conferences and source material pertaining to my writings and publications, as well as some correspondence. And then there are several file cabinets of correspondence from the late 1960s up until the present, and hard drives of correspondence and more recent works since the 1990s. There are also slide collections concerning the Samabaja Laut, and slide collections related to teaching purposes for my courses on various Southeast Asian subjects, as well as Native American history. There are taped radio interviews of noted historians, as well as tapes of related to lectures for my courses. So I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. You know, I've heard bits and pieces of these encounters during our conversations at the ARC, but hearing them woven together today was really quite something else. We have some questions from the audience, but before we field them to you, we have another installment of messages for you that we call In the Zone. So we hope you enjoy this next bit.
Thank you.
Jim, we're delighted to be able to join in the celebration of the republication of your book on the Sulu Zone. It's especially important because this brings full circle the journey that we had together when we first visited the Philippines at the time you began the research on this topic.
Congratulations, Dad, on this very important occasion. I'm really proud of my dad for the work he's undertaken as a historian over the decades. He's given a voice to people who've been marginalised, who don't have a voice, and that's such an important thing to do.
I would like to say congratulations, Opa, in launching your book in Sulu Zone.
Wow.
I hope you're ready for some questions, Jim, because we have quite a few.
I'm at a loss for words. It's truly wonderful and something, yeah. Anyway, I'll try and deal with the questions, yeah.
All right. Our first question is from Ruchi Mark Pototanon. He says, good evening, Dr. Warren. Congratulations. I have a question as a historian. Is there any topic or topics that you decided to abandon due to certain circumstances? I'm really hoping to see you soon. From Ruchi.
Okay. Hi, Ruchi. How are you? I hope you're well and in good spirits. Yes, there are a number of topics that I let go of, you could say, in a sense. I made the mistake once, many years ago, of uttering publicly the word trilogy in relation to the work on Singapore that I was doing in terms of labor migration, colonial capital in a particular urban setting. And the way I envisaged it, there was the initial, in terms of gender and history, there was the rickshaw book, then there was the Aku book, and then the final book, which was going to, from a historiographical standpoint, provide, in terms of method, or in Karen Armstrong's language, trying to make a place for the other. I was going to try and do that by looking at death, intentional and subintentional, namely suicide. But when I tried to begin to work on the subject, at that time, my daughter was about 12 years old, and I just found it too difficult to work on at that time. And then there was also, it was right around that time too, while I was working in the Philippines, that I suddenly realized in the course of doing work related to the zone that typhoons also, temporally speaking, move through the archipelago on an annual basis like the raiders. And I saw that there would be the chance there then, in terms of trying to measure change over time, that this might be a way to begin to approach a history of the archipelago. That is, to do it through an analysis, if you wish, of the cyclonic storm across time. So I began to work on that instead, and then that began to take me in a very different direction. So it stayed on the shelf. Yeah, that there is another book too, but I don't know if I'll get to do it. I mean, I think probably leave it for somebody else. But there's certainly a book that can be done, should be done. I mean, the outline for it's there. I've written parts of it on slavery, on the slave in the Banyaga in much more depth. I mean, certainly much of the material that will come over the next 3 to 5 years to the library, the primary source material especially, will enable students in the future to do that work. I mean, in relation to the Singapore work, for dramatists, novelists, playwrights, it's a very rich source indeed. Yeah.
Now, Jim, I hope you'll let me ask my own question since you brought up Aku and Karayuki San. I just wonder the thought process that got you into thinking about coroner's reports as part of your sources when you wrote that book, and what kind of care was needed using such sources, because obviously these are imperial sources. These are sources of empire. So how does a historian navigate the opportunities given by such sources while still being careful about their use?
Well, how did I first discover the source? Is that what?
Or what made you think about what made you think to use such sources?
Oh, well, it's what I would call a through source. I was looking for a source. I was looking for authentic speech. I was trying to resurrect voice, and to do that, I mean, the only way to access the voices of ordinary people, especially in the colonial context, it's those colonial regimes, bureaucratically speaking, that were most efficient in the intersection where it occurred were usually in those moments, that entailed either crime or death. So I was looking for records that involved the judicial system and or records that related to registering or recording accidents and death by misadventure, homicide, or suicide. And for the longest time, I was coming across annual reports and so forth that provided a great deal of macro empirical information that told me that there had to be other documents that provided the scaffolding for the quantitative data that was being used in these reports, but I couldn't find it. And then it was only in 1978, when I was running out of time in Singapore after having been there for several months, I went to the new magistrate court building on an off chance and inquired as to whether there would be any elderly people in the building that knew where there might be some old records kept. And sure enough, an old clerk in this brand new building that had just been opened said, yes, there are some old records that had just been transferred here a week or two ago. And they're upstairs, not downstairs in the basement, but they're upstairs. And he said, if you come tomorrow morning, I'll show them to you. So I came the next morning and I went upstairs with him and he opened the door and he pointed across this large empty room, and they're piled against the wall with the coroner's records, to the height of about 5 feet, about 30 or 40 feet long. And so that was wonderful. Historians don't very rarely get moments like that when you're searching after a particular document or source, and you basically turned over every possible lead and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And then all of a sudden you either stumble upon it or systematically you track it down. In this case, it was, in a way I stumbled upon it. I mean, I was running out of time, but I would just, on the off chance, I would try once more. The question of how do you use it? I mean, conceptually speaking, in colonial records, of course, you've got to take into account the bias involved on the part of you've got to understand the role of the people involved in producing it. You've got to understand the ecology of the institution behind the production of the documents as well. In other words, how they're codified, how they're classified, and so forth. But having said that, and you've got to be able to write about it. I mean, basically, we're moving toward the edge of the divide between history and literature, fiction and reality. When we, it's rare that if you could travel back in time and interview a person. If you can't do that, well, you're standing on the edge of consciousness and history. And this is where sometimes it's easier for the novelist, or what now I noticed there is, the limitations of empire sources and so forth. There are, individuals now who are more daring in terms of what you could call creative confabulation, in a sense. Yeah, where, they are, I wouldn't say putting words into the individual's mouth, but they're trying to understand the thought processes, the intent, the choices that people make, especially in very difficult moments, like the situation where people have to make life-affirming choices. Yeah.
Now, let me steer us back to the zone before I get scolded for. We have a question from Antonio de Castro. Would Dr. Warren have any advice to would-be scholars about research areas, perhaps those connected to his books on the Sulu zone?
Well, certainly, yeah, there are a range of areas. I mean, certainly I feel that the latter part of the 19th century, especially the period from the 1870s down to 1896, 1898, this incidentally is an era, a period when Ray Aleto did his MA thesis and looked especially at the career of Datu Utu. That's part of the dynamic of this period, and an individual like that who was thrown up and played such a critical role at that point in time, locally and regionally. But the Spanish sources for this period are especially rich. They're both the published sources and the archival sources, and they can reveal a great deal about the changes that were taking place in that period. If we're thinking about it from the standpoint of the various ethnic groups in the zone, the transitions and transformations that were occurring in their lives, they came thick and fast at that point in time due to instruments of empire and political machinations, when things really begin to start to come apart. And what happens in a system that's well articulated, and then all of a sudden it starts coming apart. And I think a lot more can be done just in that period alone, on that time period, and looking at the effects that it had on various ethnic groups in the latter part of the 19th century, close up, almost like micro-sociological, when you shift the lens, in a sense, the focus, you narrow it, come in close. Also, it goes without saying that there should be more use of vernacular texts. They're there. I mean, they're held within particular families, Jawi documents, and the use of oral traditions. That's really important, particularly to try and tease out the connections. It's probably almost too late in some ways, I mean, in terms of the age of people who have that kind of quintessential knowledge. I mean, it's a bit like Guarani. I mean, yeah, to do the oral history work, especially along the outer edges of the zone, particularly up the rivers all along the east coast of Borneo, among the various ethnic groups there in terms of recollections of their oral traditions and interactions with Tausug and Samo-speaking peoples on the coast. Yeah, I mean, that's just two examples, but there are others too. I think there's, for people who have the interest and or the skills, the background, for example, in boat building and in boat building traditions, the sources in Spain, both the models in the museums and wonderful work that some of the Spanish curators, as well as Spanish naval officers who, of course, hunted the Samal and the Rung Bailini down, their descriptions of the prows, their sketches, there's several theses there that could be done as well. That's just 3 examples. I mean, there are others.
We have an interesting question from Patricio Abinales.
Oh, okay.
Sir Jojo asks, the
Yeah.
first time OW talked to me, he was bumming a cigarette from me. When he learned I was from Mindanao, he immediately said, "Have you read Warren? You should read Warren. You cannot write your dissertation without his book." My question is, what questions did Walters ask you in your thesis defense?
Ah, how interesting. How interesting. Well, he didn't ask very many questions at all. I mean, you'd have to understand the context of the thesis defense. There were 3 individuals involved. Jeremy Beckett, who was an anthropologist who had actually had become involved, interested in Mindanao and was doing ethnographic and historical research on Mindanao. But all of Jeremy's other work had been involved with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people on the northeastern side of Australia, from the colonial period right down to the present. So there was Jeremy, and then there was John Legg, who was the doyen of historians of Southeast Asia at that point in time in Australia, who was a political historian, cultural historian of Indonesia, had written a very important biography of Sukarno. And then there was Walters, who they flew out especially to Australia in March 1976 for my oral exam and to take part in a very important conference at that point at the ANU. Well, we sat down and Walters was sitting on my right, Jeremy on my left, and Legg directly opposite me, who was the chair. And without going into great detail, John Legg led off with 1 or 2 questions, and he asked me a question about the historiography of Sulu and the writings of several historians. And he thought maybe I had been too harsh with them, and I hadn't been at all, actually. And so I responded and asked Professor Legg at that time, I said, well, how would you have dealt with it? I was curious. And he looked at me and he said, you're not supposed to answer the questions. Ask the questions. And then Jeremy jumped in and he said, well, as an ethnographer, I understand perfectly what Mr. Warren is saying. And then Walters jumped in and said, I concur. And then the 2 of them spoke to one another, not to me, but to Legg for 15 minutes. And then they looked at one another and smiled. And then the tea lady came in and served tea and biscuits. And then Legg said, do you have any questions now? And I said, no. And then Jeremy said, well, what are you going to do now with your thesis? And I said, well, I've been thinking about this work I'd like to do on labor, migration, and capital in urban setting across Southeast Asia, comparing Jakarta, Manila, and Rangoon possibly. And he looked at me and he said, my God, the body is still warm. And I didn't realize how prophetic that would be because, of course, the through source that would become the basis for writing both the rickshaw book and the Aku and Karayuki-san book was going to be the coroner's records. Yeah, but what was most interesting was when we walked out of the room in the chancellery at the ANU to go to a social get-together that had been planned at Tony Reed's house for Ruth McVeigh, who was visiting at that time. Walters was walking right next to me, and he had his fedora hat on, he had the pipe clenched in his teeth, and he was wearing his trench coat. And he said, he said, "You write very well." He said, "I really liked it." And I turned to him and I said, "Do you remember what you said to me 4 years ago?" And he looked at me kind of with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, "No, what did I say?" So I repeated it. I said that you told me that I would have to set aside my interests in Mindanao and Sulu for 2 years and learn Vietnamese. And he looked at me again sideways and he said, "Did I really say that?" And I said, "Yes." And that was the end of the conversation. So actually, Oliver Walters really didn't ask many questions. In the end, I felt like I was sitting there and it was like the elephants fighting and the grass was getting trampled and it was Leg who was in the middle. I was just watching. Yeah.
We have a question from Hans Hagerdal.
From
You
Hans.
have done great work in letting the subaltern speak. What post-colonial scholars have been discussing in recent decades? What do you think are the pros and cons of post-colonial theories as applied to historical studies?
Oh, wow. I think they have a very important role to play. I mean, there are certain scholars of the subaltern school. I mean, if we're thinking in a post-colonial context, particularly years back, I mean, much of the really fine work, particularly on peasants, was done by Ranajit Guha and people around him. The one thing, that I've learned, I guess you could say at a most rudimentary level, in terms of post-colonial scholarship, is how important it is to read a text carefully and to be able, to deconstruct it in an appropriate manner. It does have a place. I think, again, it's about, if we're trying to find a place for the other, conceptually, how can you do that? How can you get to that point in terms of developing or acquiring a methodology that will enable that to happen? The theory, the body of theory and the practice associated with post-colonial scholarship can help you to do that, especially when you drop down through the social strata and push back in time, when you're working with documents from the 17th and 18th century, and you're reading sources that have been written by people who come from a different solar system or another world, and they're visiting another place, and they bring with them all the intellectual and cultural baggage, and you've got to take that apart first. You've got to be able to disentangle all that and set that all out before you can even then begin to tease out from that, glean from that, aspects of what they have observed, what they have said, that will enable you to find a place in this, again, to use Karen Armstrong's language, find a place for the other. Find a place for the other. I mean, I'm not, in my own work, in terms of post-colonial scholarship, I mean, I don't really feel I have an overall command of the literature. It is a very important body of theory, though, and especially, I mean, I think that, you know, the if your work is largely limited or restricted to text solely. Yeah.
I think a lot of people still want to ask questions, but we're a bit short on time. So
go a little,
we do have one more video to show you, Jim, before we go on. So I think we'll play the video first.
They've been all such a surprise, and they've been all so wonderful. And I can only say thank you again to everybody who has been involved in not only the videos, but in terms of putting this event together.
Well, there's one more, and I hope you enjoy this one.
Okay, thank you.
ワレン先生、お久しぶりです。お元気ですか? Hi Jim, I'm proud of being one of your students in Australia. Well, I have to tell you how much I was shocked when I saw my first essay written in 1986 about the Kara exam, filled with your comment in red ink. It was hard for me to read your handwriting to start with. That's how my study began with you. Yes, certainly you guided me and trained me to become social historian. ありがとうございました。
Congratulations, Jim, on achieving 40-year milestone since your book, The Sulu Zone, was first published. I remember walking into your office for the first time at Murdoch University and feeling like I'd walked into the TARDIS, Doctor Who's TARDIS. It was small on the outside, but walking in, it's just this huge collection of books on 4 walls from ceiling to floor. I couldn't believe how many you have, so it's so evident how much you love reading and writing and all things literature, and you've passed that on to so many people, that loved on to so many people, including myself. A couple of months ago, Jim gave me a book from his precious library at Murdoch, and I'm really, really grateful to you for that one, Jim. Thanks so much, and congratulations once and more on your achievement.
Congratulations, Jim, for the 40th anniversary edition of your classic work, The Sulu Zone. And a big thank you for gifting us with your professional library. Those shelves of neatly arranged red binder folders were one of the things I noticed when I first stepped foot in your office. I think we discussed the organization of my thesis that day. I was still wrestling with the whole thing in my mind, but I felt comforted when I saw those shelves, that if I can similarly organize all my materials and information, the thesis will be doable. And what a journey thesis writing and research have been. And for that, no words could express how grateful I am. Again, congratulations.
Hi, I'm Jelly Galang, Jim's former student at Murdoch. 3 things I learned from Jim and from his works, especially from his Sulu Zone. First, in doing research, explore areas beyond Manila and Luzon. There are also exciting and interesting events that occurred outside of these areas. Second, try to focus on people's experiences. While the structures are important, how people lived and survived make a more exciting account about the past. And finally, reconstruct the stories of marginalized people. As scholars, we have the obligation to resurrect the voices of these people at the edge of history in the historical narrative.
In my first weeks as Jim Warren's student, he invited me to lunch at this noodle shop. And at this lunch, he spoke to me for an hour or so about a man from Murdoch's custodial staff who had sailed through Polynesia with his whole family over the course of a lifetime. And Jim kept bringing the conversation back to this man, and at the time, I wasn't sure why. But looking back on it, I think this little story is emblematic of how Jim approaches history. Jim, at his core, is a man who gathers stories. And he has the patience and willingness to listen, to learn from, and to empathize with those who share those stories. And this is why Jim is such an exceptional historian, because he can bring that same talent back to sources and use it to resuscitate some of the humanity buried in archival documents. As a student, I got to watch Jim do this kind of work every day. And to me, it was a lesson, both in how to perform history, but also how to live, that will stay with me forever.
Dr. Warren was the nicest of people. I think he's the nicest person I've met in person. When I was there, he prepared for my living space. He prepared for my readings and all the things that a student would need to prepare for his thesis or to make good on his thesis. He also was the only faculty member who would spend time with students, even those who we didn't know. He was always concerned about how they were doing. He would always end his email with, keep at it and stay well. And I think he epitomizes that. Thank you very much for everything, Dr. Warren. Happy 40th anniversary on the publishing of the book, Sulu.
Congratulations, Jim. I am really happy for your 40th anniversary editions of the Sulu Zone. Your book is one of the most important books that I read since I was a bachelor student in Southeast Asian history. And it was really a blessing for me to finally be able to learn a lot directly from you as a PhD student since 2019. You always said to think and reflect further in the context of discovery before entering the context of presentation. That is really important for me as a junior scholar actually, not to confuse everything in the beginning because, as you always said, there is a time for everything, including to discover and to present our discovery. And then you also remind us to keep a good and stable pace in our research. Like you always said, good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. Thank you very much, Jim. Congratulations again.
As we're coming to the end of our program, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us on this special occasion as we celebrate 40 years of the Sulu Zone and Professor Warren's generous donation of his professional library to the Ateneo. We are most grateful to Jim and everyone for sharing this moment with us. Good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. We will stop the live streaming after this video ends, but for those in the Zoom room, feel free to stay and say your greetings to Dr. Warren for a few minutes. We do want to let those of you who are interested in purchasing a copy of the book that it's available on Lazada at 20% discount from today until the 31st. So you have a few days if you want to get a copy of the anniversary edition of the book. Thank you to those who woke up early or are sleeping late. Thank you, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Jim, I'll let you have the last word.
I'm at a loss for words, Brian. I can only say thank you to everybody who has been involved. And it's so good to see some of you, even if it's only virtually. For all my friends and colleagues, I can only reiterate again, yeah, I've learned so much from all of you. And yeah, that's all. Yeah, it's just.
I think before you leave the meeting, you could look at the chat box, and there's quite a few messages I think from some people who maybe just wanted you to read it. But yeah, thank you again, Jim, and thank you everyone.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. So should I open this, hon? Just have a look at this now. So you knew about this all along.